beginning in Chapter 3, and for most of the course, we turn our attention to the study of markets. And a market is a pretty broad term we use for anywhere buyers and sellers exchange goods and services. Sometimes it's a market that's on the internet and buyers and sellers never see each other. Sometimes it's a local market like this European street market. If I were an accomplished traveler, I could probably tell you where that is, but I can't. When we talk about markets, we specify the good or service that we're talking about. We specify the geographical boundary of the market we're talking about, and we specify a time period. Are we looking at a week, a month, a year, whatever? Every market is a bit different because of the nature of the regulation affecting the market. Does the government simply assign property rights and walk away, or are there license fees, or other regulations? I'll give you some examples in a minute. Also, the time it takes, depending on the product. The time can be very long to increase or decrease capacity. Think about auto plants or Intel fabs or even apartment stock. We'll talk about that in a second. How long does the product last? A banana might be only good for a day or two before it's spotty and nobody will buy it. Or a refrigerator will last most people 10, 20 years. I think mine's older than that. Anyway, so the specifics matter, but we're going to be able to generalize in talking about our markets, at least to some degree, and I'll show you to what degree in a moment. Let's give some examples of markets from just Forest Grove. One, there's the Forest Grove Farmers Markets, Wednesdays in the afternoon, May through October. Pretty free entry. If a vendor wants to sell there, they can get a permit and be up and running in a day or so. If they don't want to participate, they just don't, and they're done. And there's a fair number of sellers. There's foot traffic, local buyers. It's a pretty simple market. Products are mostly perishable. There's some crafts. Government assigns property rights. You couldn't go up and just take stuff without getting in trouble. But otherwise, government also closes Main Street, but otherwise the government doesn't intervene to a great degree in this market. Another example, Forest Grove rental apartment market. Some of you participate in that market. And here it's a little different, right? It's firms, if a real estate investor wants to build an apartment complex, you got to get permits, you got to line up builders. It can be a year or two easy before you bring that that endeavor to the point where you can actually rent out rooms, apartments to customers. If you want to leave that industry, you're going to pretty much have to find somebody else that wants to buy apartment housing stock. Those buildings aren't much good for anything. Sometimes you can turn an apartment into a condominium, but generally speaking, you're going to have to knock it down and use the land for something else if you want to get out of the apartment business. Apartments are a little interesting. We're going to study the economics of information later in the course, and there's actually a commitment problem when in markets where there's asymmetric information and high search costs. Job markets, you think of people signing contracts. Both the buyer and the seller have an interest in maybe breaking a promise to rent because they found something better, or an apartment owner found a better tenant. So we have these institutions that the market, it's not government, markets have developed. We have these one-year leases that commit buyers and sellers and make the market work better. Government, I guess, has to adjudicate disputes in court, but other than that, the government isn't telling who the seller has to sell to, at what price, etc. Sometimes there's some deals where governments will require a certain amount of low-income housing, so it does get a little more complicated than that. My last example, retail electricity market in Forest Grove is a real interesting one. Forest Grove Power, or Light and Power, I always want to say Power and Light, but it's Light and Power, This is a city-owned natural monopoly that has the sole right to sell electricity in town, and sometimes a city will regulate a private monopolist, but here in Forest Grove, the city actually bought out the utility and the city runs it. So it's a pretty interesting case. The other interesting thing here is how different the retail market is. They're regulated natural monopolies in every city. The nature of the regulation can vary city to city. But the wholesale market, power plants selling electricity to the grid, really has a lot of interesting variety. But there's all sorts of special rules governing who can supply power to the grid, what price they get, etc. Homeowners with solar panels can sell back some electricity. The government established that right. The states have required a certain amount of wind power, etc. The federal government runs the Bonneville Power Administration that sells us the electricity from the dams, the hydropower. So there's some interesting institutional detail there. So we'll study natural monopoly in chapter, I think it's chapter 8 anyway, in a while.
Made with Doodlecast Pro.